For now, I'd like to introduce Yaron, our CTO. Welcome, and take it away.
Thank you. Well, I'm not going to get up on stage because I'll probably fall off, so it's okay with you guys, I'll be down here. So my name is Yaron Baitch. I'm the CTO of Centralized Technologies. I'm also the CEO of an MSP called Digital Practice Inc., which is in Hawaii. Our goal here is to kind of give you guys an understanding of what scaling is like, right? You guys know every single day as you're growing your practices, you're buying, you're acquiring, you're going through this whole managed, process of what you do from diligence perspective, from a financial perspective, from technology investments, what's going to happen. Being that it's a Friday morning after a long evening, death by PowerPoint is probably not what you guys want. So we'll make it a little more iterative. But we will go through some of the slides because there's a whole bunch of stuff to talk about. Everything from what's your technology foundation to compliance and regulation and what tools are you using. And after listening to the panels yesterday, the vendor base, right? That's a huge thing. The cybersecurity components, everything associated with that is really, really important. So, if there's any questions throughout this, just pop in. I have no problems listening to them and trying to give you guys, some direction on it. We've dealt with a number of DSOs. We've helped scale not just our business, but their businesses. So this is our wheelhouse. This is what we have experience in. And we made a ton of mistakes along the way, and we've had really strong successes as well. So, learning from our mistakes is one thing, but learning from our successes is another. And that's what we want to continue to do, is continue to have successful integration, continue growth acquisition strategies, and help the practices who are coming to us and the DSOs who are coming to us, help them scale from a technology platform. So you guys can focus on growing your businesses, and we can help focus on the technology. So technical infrastructure, these are the key, right? So what are we talking about? Is everything from on-prem, you have servers on site, to what are you using for data analytics? And we have vendors here who have these tools, and we have vendors here who are talking about practice management solutions. All these components that we're talking about are absolutely essential because and this is something Patrick's talked about many times. There's things that we look at from the technology stack that for years, everyone looked at IT as a cost center. It was a cost center, plain and simple. But now, without infrastructure and without your technology, you cannot operate. So, if your system's down, that's it. You can't see a patient in a chair. You can't, take scans. You can't do anything. So, the investment is a real investment. It's an investment in your opportunity and your growth. It is not, and we cannot stress this enough. When somebody says, "Oh, well, I have to spend on this," the word spend should go away. I have to invest in this, and I want to invest in this because I'm investing in my future and I'm investing in the growth of the company. Cloud-based systems prevalency is everywhere now, right? Everything is a cloud. We're talking AI now in the cloud. We're talking, everything from AI to doing data analytics, to doing diagnosis, to doing, business modeling, to understanding, market potential, all sorts of things. So all those things come together. Now you have all these tools out there, and we'll go through each one of these a little more, but as you have all these tools out there, how are you supporting this IT operation? You go in and you buy a practice, and you set it up, and you onboard them, and you move them to a new practice management software, or you move them to a new imaging solution. How are you supporting this? I mean, we deal with, tens of thousands of calls a month from a support perspective, and how do we triage that? How do we approach that? And how are you guys dealing with that, the onboarding? Because you're getting not just questions on technology stack, you might be getting questions on business operations, or standard operating procedures, or how you're dealing with billing or whatever. So all these things come into play, and what group is triaging that? 9 times out of 10, if somebody has a problem, they're calling the help desk, and it's usually the help desk who's kind of redirecting them. Now, if you have a good process in place to say, if it's a finance question, it goes to the finance team or whatever, but you don't want to give your staff and your employees 20 different numbers to call, right? You just say, hey, put a ticket in or whatever it is, and then we will help triage that. Data management, another thing that's super important. Like, without knowing what our environments are and what they have in them, you're not going to be successful in business, right? So if you have all these practices that are performing, and you have, one in an area that is, super performing, and one that's, a mile and a half down the road that's underperforming, what's the data show you? So that's something we'll talk about. That's why there's a lot of tools actually, and some tools in here that can help do that. Integration and interoperability, right? Those are two terrible buzzwords because everything has to integrate and everything has to work together. If they don't, forget, right? So you buy, let's say you have 50 practices that is part of your growth strategy for the year, and this is what you want to do. Well, chances are you'll have a dozen different systems, from practice management. You'll probably have 50 different financial systems. You'll probably have reporting done, metrics, you'll have KPIs that are tracked differently, fee schedules that are different. All these things coming together are going to be a big problem. So the integration and interoperability is something we're going to touch on as well. IT governance and compliance. There's the HIPAA police in the room right now. He's standing back there. Right there. He will come knock on your. No, just kidding.
Zero fun.
But it is a real concern. Right? There's regulations. There's interoperability regulations as well now. We'll talk about one of those. And then, as we talk about, what are we trying to accomplish here? The conclusion is we want to make sure that you have the tools in front of you to support your growth and to support your ability to do business. All ready, Michelle?
It should be.
Here we
Is
go
the,
again.
See, IT guy.
it's really should be closer to the.
Yeah.
Oh, there.
Oh, look at that. Five slides later. Okay, excellent. So we talked about this, right? So the key here is
That
what is your
clicker is
infrastructure look
made
like?
for you to be standing on stage.
I had a mimosa this morning. So and obviously Patrick got me all confused here.
Yeah.
So as you're supporting our growth, your growth, right? What are the tools you need, right? So as we're talking about this and what has to get done, we have a whole slew of tools. There's literally more things than we can shake a stick at. There's vendors in here that some people have already talked to. There's new vendors. There's things that we see in the industry. I don't know if anyone's been to the local dental association show or any of the other conferences. There are vendors selling everything, like in every technology conference. Everyone and it was talked yesterday during the vendor meeting, right? You had three super smart people up on the stage dealing with potentially thousands of vendors between the three of them. And every one of them, has the next best thing, right? Everyone's got the next best mousetrap. And the challenge is that how do you hold these things to accountability and how do you make sure they actually work? So cloud-based, we all know this, right? So everyone's moving cloud. It's just what it is, and we have to embrace it. There was a while there where people were saying, no, it's gonna fall apart. It's not on-premise where we need to be. We want to control the data. We want it to be in our environment. That is something that is going away. It's plain and simple. It's going away. There will still be on-premise for sure. There are environments where you just have to from a data standpoint. But the vast majority, is moving towards that. And I think, we see that it's happening more and more. And from our perspective, we've had this discussion a couple years ago at Sunset, is that all these technology software providers were saying, you're not going to need IT if you move to cloud. Sure, really? You think that's going to be the case? Well, what happens when your internet connection is down, or you can't get access to a database, or very simple operational components that you're missing? You need IT more than ever. The days are when you had an on-prem environment and you had one room down, no big deal. You could shift patients, you could move around. That was one component, right? Well, if you have a system that's down because you don't have redundant internet, redundant pipes, Ron, I think yesterday was saying, one of the locations that they have, but multiple locations and redundant pipes or disparate connections, and it might be if I'm wrong, tell me, but I think it was Ron who said that. From a data perspective, that's absolutely critical, right? So having that core infrastructure and that core backbone to support this is super important. You can have a data center in your environment. You can have a closet with network connections and have server managers and all the other things, which is still happening, and there's still a lot of it. We have not transitioned to the cloud fully, but knowing that it's that it's there, it's really prevalent, and the tools are becoming much better. I mean, many years ago when Shine first released Ascend and Patterson did their first go around, which Dan was involved in, it was very, very archaic. But if we look back at what our systems were back in the day, all their on-prem services were the same way. So now they're getting to have the same feel that cloud-based imaging is really picking up now. I mean, and if you think about that from a technology standpoint, that's amazing. And when you look at a 3D scan on how much data that is, and we're not working on the cloud, it's absolutely nuts. So to think about how we're able to do that and how we're able to kind of move into that space is super important. We have those two, your cloud-based, EHR and your practice management. We have all the support, right? So you have a help desk, you have, dealing with everything from, I can't take an image to, I wasn't able to, to process the claim to, the schedule has duplicate entries. How are you dealing with this? Well, we deal with it in a very specific way because, we know we have a help desk process put in place and how we build it. That's something that really needs to be taken into account because as you're scaling and you're growing, how are you dealing with, the potentially, every practice, if it's a, even a small scale practice is potentially 20 new end users, right? Very easily. And you do that, you have a growth over the year, you're talking thousands of new users on your network that you're now maintaining and monitoring and having this whole idea around, which is why, partnering with a really good vendor helps you with that. It lets you focus on doing your part of growing your business and lets, the technology vendor deal with that. Support and operations, right? The data management, the centralized data warehousing. That is where we live and die by the data now, right? So a lot of you guys have, I'm sure, piggyback, and they are looking at what's the numbers look like, right? What does the money look like? Well, data. How are you gonna get it? Are you billing? Are your fee schedules correct? Are you adjusting for regional, costs? Are you being able to produce timely reports? Are you able to close months out on time? That's all data driven, right? But that same component is, you have all these things and you have all these people accessing the data. How are you securing it, right? You cannot have a huge data warehouse that's wide open. It just doesn't work. From a security standpoint, from a compliance standpoint, from a data analytics standpoint, it's a scary thing. And we want to make sure that everything you're doing, you're thinking about is, inherent, implicitly allow, inherently deny, right? So you're very specific on what you allow, but you block everything else. Well, that worked in the first few days of Microsoft Windows Server. When 2008 came out, I was like, "This is what we're going to do. This is how it's going to work." Well, that breaks things really, really, really quickly because you have people who say they can't do their job. Well, how do you fix that? How do you migrate that and mitigate that risk? With cloud stuff, it's a lot more granularity, and you can do that. So you can create groups and manage a lot easier. But if you have that in an on-prem environment, and you have servers that are talking through VPNs to each other or through some direct connections, you have a whole other set of management that you have to deal with. And that's hard. And that's very, very hard. And that's, when I started off in this career, I was actually, 6'2", had a full head of hair. That's all gone now because of this business. And because it's up, how we kept up with it. And that's one of the things as you look about what we're trying to do and how we're working, compliance and security is going to come back every single time. I mean, we talk about this, we're talking about the CrowdStrike incident, right? How many times has anyone looked on the Health and Human Services Wall of Shame recently? The number is increasing every single day, and it's scary. And it's to the point right now where how many times during the week you get an email or a piece of mail saying, "Oh, you've been involved in a breach. Oh, sign up for credit protection." I mean, it just happens. That's what it is. There's nothing we can do about it because the data is out there. I mean, when you have, the cyber criminals going out there and literally, every American social security number is, on the dark web. Everyone. I mean, there's nothing to do about it. And that's the problem, right? When we're starting to talk about this now, it's not just your problem because you're dealing with it as an individual, but you're now dealing with it for every one of your patients as well, right? So you're trying to secure your border, and your border extends, right? So there's this environment that you think about, we call it the enclave environment, right? So what's under your control? And when you can control that scope and keep that scope as small as possible, you're limiting your attack vectors, you're limiting what people can gain access to, right? So by keeping that scope small, that goes back to the data management, that goes back to the data security. How do you continue to make sure that happens? Integration and interoperability, right? Everything's got to talk to each other and everything's got to work to each other. That's where, the HL7, that's actually a really cool, compliance regulation at this point where it's allowing tools, disparate tools from different processes, different service providers to talk to each other. That's like, if you think about it from a networking perspective, or it's a universal language, right? It's something that things can work together with. So those standards are really happening. APIs and middleware, right? APIs are how you're getting all these software tools and all these, your AI tools and all your local cloud management and everything talking together, right? APIs are how the programs are talking to each other. We see that we developed a product ourselves, a network scanning tool that has a ton of APIs, and one little change breaks it. I mean, it just causes a problem, and it's like completely out of our control, but then it impacts one of our customers. And it impacts them immediately, because then, as Ron said on stage yesterday, if we're at best 3 degrees off, that's not what he wants, right? And that's the thing. So when we're on point and we're on target and then one little change happens, it doesn't make it 3 degrees off, it makes it 90 degrees off, and it's completely broken. So working on that and making sure all your vendors work together is something that is going to be a continual challenge. And until the standards are effectively managed across the board, we're going to be in a tough spot from our businesses, because you're going to have vendors coming in and say, I can talk to this. Oh yeah, I can provide this report for you. Oh, I can do this, I can get this data to you. And then when you see it, you're like, this is nothing what I asked for. That's a big thing. I mean, it was set up on stage a few times during the vendor panel. Like, that's really, really, really important to understand that. So as you're looking at it and you're looking at vendors and you're looking to understand what you need, what do you need? Like, what data are you looking for? Like, when you go to a vendor, and I have a software background, and my mantra when I had my company was, oh, well, they must be wrong. We built this, it's perfect. Like, that's what you do, right? Engineers have, the biggest egos in the world. Like, it can't be broken. Well, guess what? The person who's paying you says it's broken, it's broken. It really is, it's that simple, that's how, supply and demand in economics works, right? If they say the person who wants to write the check says it's not working, then it's not working. And that's the driver here, right? So when you're talking about interoperability and you're trying to get data out of a practice management software, or out of a financial system, or out of a help desk ticketing system, so you can have real data and you can't get it, or it's in completely, disparate formats, you're in a really, really, really tough spot. If I have to go up on stage, it's going to be a mess.
Don't do it.
Do it, just do it.
Like an hour later.
All right.
The back and forth between the business and IT right there.
Yeah, made a decision, and now I'm committed to it. So if I fall, it's all on whoever needs something. So cloud-based practice management, right? We all know that there's now a much larger preference, right? So the big players are now getting involved. There are some really, really good ones. There are some ones who, they're probably the best ones on the planet. I used Ron's joke yesterday. So knowing that there are a lot of options out there, but the options are actually getting better and better. For a while there was like, oh, we're just going to do cloud. And what they did is they took their desktop application, ported it into the cloud, and thought it was going to work. It doesn't work like that. It's a ground-up implementation. So seeing these and seeing how they're able to do really listening and having, because I remember when Curve when Ascend was first released. I mean, that was back in 2016, I think, is when the first iterations of that. I mean, that's a long time ago, and it's now getting there. And in Curve, and there's a whole bunch of them throughout the years have kind of matured and become a better tool. Cloud is amazing for DSOs, absolutely amazing, because central data source, right? Central data source, not different systems, not different databases, not someone else worried about managing it. Having that in control and in your environment and having the right access to it is really, really amazing to see, because you can actually get real data. It's not to say that an on-prem environment is not useful, because it is useful in some places. It's really useful, if you really want to have a full data warehouse that you want to have access to immediately. If you want to do some AI modeling internally, we see people are doing their own internal AI modeling, and they need an environment. So as you think about that, and what we're doing with cloud is really the next phase. But as you're thinking about it, is the cloud provider that you're going to use, do they really understand the DSO business? Because everyone sees DSO, everyone sees the market as, that's consolidation that's happening, it's moving forward. But can they provide that? Some, yes. Some remarkably well. Others, say they can, they've done okay with it, but still have challenges, and others just point blank can't. It's just single practitioner, small practice, they just want to get something easy. I mean, we see this in the Hawaiian Islands a lot because we support all the islands, and being able to get to an outer island is not as easy as just getting in the car and going over. So, you know, we get a call from a practice in Kauai and says they need something and they're down. Well, it's not as simple as just saying, hey, you know, we're going to be over there, 20 minutes, we'll be in the car. You got to go to the airport, you got to get on the plane, you got to go through, you go through security and get over there and get your rental car and then wherever you need to be. So it's a problem. But if you have this with a cloud environment, well, 9 times out of 10 is a call to the ISP. And, or, hey, just reboot your router or whatever it is. And, with out-of-band tools and so on and so forth, it makes it a lot easier. But when we're looking at it and what data components are available to us, seeing that in the cloud, you have this so much visibility into everything that's going on across your platform. I mean, when you're talking hundreds of practices, the data volume, the data warehouse you have and the volume you have is unbelievable. And for IT nerds like me, looking at that is really amazing. You look at a Tableau database, like the ADA has a great Tableau database about ideas and metrics around demographics for dentists. So you can go on their website and what state and their age range and and where they their backgrounds and their schooling and so on and so forth. It's all live data. Being able to do that from a financial standpoint would be amazing. You understand. So when you do a quarterly review for your shareholders and you're looking or you're doing your annual leadership meeting, you have data available to you immediately. That's amazing, and that's something that with all these new tools and all these new reporting infrastructures, you can really build on that. So the other thing too that's really important as you think about it is backup and recovery, right? So we know that when you're on-prem and you have a backup environment, and Sunset has a lot of experience with backup and recovery, and using a ton of different tools to recover from the cloud. That idea of having your area of control and your liability passed off to someone else from a HIPAA standpoint and from a security standpoint is absolutely amazing. It's not your problem. It is your problem because your system's down, but it's on them. So they need to provide you with all the documentations and all the proof around how they're backing up, what's their mean time to recovery, what's their mean time to response, what are their SLAs for an outage. When all those things, what contractual obligations do they have to do from a financial standpoint? If they're down for X amount of time, do you get money back? Where this whole thing now with CrowdStrike, everyone's saying, it take weeks to get things up and running. Well, their end user agreement pretty much saved them from saving. Now they're going to get sued, of course, of the yin-yang, and they will end up having to pay something, but their end user agreement basically precluded them from having any financial responsibility. Listen, I've written software, I've been involved with end user agreements. I don't even know. And so when you're clicking through and you're doing software, you can actually understand that. So what are the backup components? What are the things that need to get taken care of? How are you managing that? These backup and recovery solutions, and also one of the things I was talking in the cyber panel, can you recover? How quickly can you recover? Because if you're not seeing patients and if you're not having your office filled and your schedule filled, you are not generating revenue. And you're not generating revenue, that's a problem. Right? Because at the end of the day, it comes down to the bottom line. So recovery, testing, making sure that you do have a full disaster recovery plan and it's implemented and it's documented. And that if you ever are in a position where you did have an outage and somebody does come in and do a forensic analysis, you have all the checkboxes checked and you have all your documentation in place and you have proven that you've done a disaster recovery test and that it's actually taking place and reviewed. Those are so important because when we think about it, even though we're reducing our scope by what we have control over by going out to the cloud, there's still things that you have to do. You still have to test these things. And you still have to make sure that they're secure. It's still ultimately your responsibility because you're the owner of the practice and the DSO who's managing it. The software that sits out there, you're making that decision. I think that actually just this morning we were talking at breakfast for a moment and basically saying, when you're the decision maker, it all falls on your shoulders, right? So a lot of people here are making decisions for the technology and trying to make effective decisions comes into play, especially when you have liability and responsibility on your shoulders. So scaling, right? So we're talking about if you have a cloud-based system, you point it to a URL, you install some local drivers for imaging, whatever, and then you're done. It's pretty simple, right? From an IT perspective. How about from a user perspective? Not so simple, right? Everyone is used to, we all know dentists hate change, right? They just don't want to do it. We see it every day that trying to tell somebody they have to update their environment, or they have to update their practice management software. They don't want to change. Their staff doesn't want to change, their office managers don't want to change. They have to embrace the change, and your goal here is to make sure that you can kind of get them in a mindset to be like, this is going to make your life easier. It's less you have to worry about, right? So it's all about the trainers. It's all about the communication, right? Communication strategies are so important. Updates and maintenance. That is something that if it's happening on the cloud, it's one touch and it's done. But the problem with that too is that if it's one touch and it was a bad update, what happens? Exactly, CrowdStrike. Everything falls apart. Well, when you're having an on-prem environment and you can actually test the patching and you have a good IT provider or a good internal IT department, they're testing everything ahead of time. So they're not just rolling out and deploying. If they're rolling out and deploying without doing that, you probably have a problem. You should probably have to talk to them because that's really risky. But knowing that, that when something happens, if it doesn't go through the proper QA and it breaks your system, it breaks everybody's system. And that's something as you're in a scaled environment and your environment that's as big as it is, you really need to make sure that that's in place. The other thing too is enhanced collaboration, right? So remote work, we see that all the time. There is in our industry there does require a lot of on-prem because you actually have to be with patients, seeing them, whatever. But all the back-end stuff can be remote. Finance can be remote. HR can be remote. Scheduling and billing can be remote. A lot of that super easily. Infrastructure controls are in place. You're now not managing personal computers. It's all done with almost proper two-factor authentications in play. Systems are updated. Sandbox environments are built so they can work effectively. It's there. Team communication, right? It's really super simple in a cloud-based app to communicate to everybody. Because when we see it all the time, we have some who, and they decided on their own that they're going to put Slack in their office, or they're going to use Teams, or they're going to use, Google Chat, or they're going to use whatever, which is fine for them, but it doesn't help from a global communication standpoint. So being able to have that through the cloud is super important. So infrastructure, right? So if you're going to the cloud, you're scaling and you're talking about growth, right? So when you are building out a new practice, is it, from a management perspective, and that you need new machines because you're doing, new types of imaging and you're getting, you're doing more 3D work or you're doing implants, whatever, so you need higher horsepower computers. But do you need the enormous servers that you've needed in the past? Probably not. Some cases still yes, and that there's still a valid need for that. But how do you build a high-speed, network, and how do you build it reliably, right? So do you have disparate internet service providers? Do you have, multiple firewalls in place that, can, in the blink of an eye, without any impact on the customers, continue to operate? Do you have load balancers? Do you have all the firewalls set up correctly? These are all the things that happen in the back end. That it's not just a matter of hey, you plug in the internet connection, turn on the Wi-Fi, and you're good to go. It's there's a lot more to it. So while it makes your operation easier having it in the cloud, you still have to make sure connectivity is taking place and how that infrastructure is managed is really important, because when you're thinking every single day on what is done, right? And if somebody can't proceed and work through the day and get a very simple thing as having a chair filled with a patient in the chair, that is a big problem. And if your network infrastructure can't support that, again, we talk about certain places, around the country, we see it in the Midwest where, it takes 2 hours to drive someplace, or when you have bad weather, how do you support something? If you have a really good, robust cloud infrastructure, really good, robust network infrastructure, it gives you the opportunity to, have fully secure, fully remote, and, a compliant infrastructure. The redundancy and failover part of it, though, are something that people always forget. And while they say they do have, I have, Spectrum and Frontier, is Spectrum and Frontier running fiber off the same pole to your building? Like, if that pole goes down, you lost both connections, right? Is one going above ground, one going underground? Are you using, a microwave bridge? Are you using, point-to-points? Are you using whatever? you need to take that into account. You need to have, your engineering teams really look at that, or have your IT provider, really make sure they understand what is at stake. Because you can have two separate IPs, two separate internet service providers, and you're getting billed for two separate service providers, but if they both come into the data center, or where your network closet is through the same pipe, there's a problem, right? That's something that people need to take into account. So IT support, operations, right? So I'm sure everyone at this point either is working with internal IT or has an outside service provider. In doing that and having that centralized support, what is the time everybody calls when they're not calling just to say hello. They're not calling to say, how's it going, right? They don't call the help desk when they just want to know what the weather's like where you're sitting. They're calling because something's broken. And that's a problem, right? Because you want to make sure that you're resolving the problem. So as long as you're communicating effectively, I mean, I'm sure I can't ever remember a time where somebody just called the help desk to be like, hey, did you see the game last night? It just doesn't happen. And while it'd be great if it did, because it would build a better relationship that way, it's not the case. So our job, especially as a service provider, is to make sure that everything is done effectively and communicated effectively, and proper expectations are set, and communication is really in place. Like quick resolution, right? That's a key. Like our goal is at Sunset and at DPI is first call resolution. Somebody calls in, solve the problem first call, that's it, done, right? Send out the idea, and if you move it, and if they get the customer's monitor, and then they give back their 5-star review and the smiley face, that's great, right? A lot of times you can't do it first call resolution, and you do need to continue and escalate and figure it out. And if that's the case, communication is so important. So making sure you have the right communication platform in place, and your ticketing system and your internal monitoring is set up properly, that it's not just sitting in a queue. Like you don't have tickets sitting there from 2 years ago. That doesn't do anybody any good. It could have been resolved, and the customer may not have called back about that same issue, but it's still sitting in the system, and that's bad data. So when you're running an analytics and you're running reports that say, hey, I need to do this or that for my system, and I'm trying to understand my IT budget, we have tickets from 2 years ago in there, that's not a real indicator. Right? So making sure you have good hygiene in terms of how you're managing your centralized support tickets and your network operations center is super important. The asset management is something that we take very, very seriously. We work with a couple of companies here with a tool that we built that worked sometimes very well, other times worked terribly. Point blank. And its job was to find assets. Its job was to find what's on the network, and sometimes it was terrific, and sometimes it just couldn't get the job done. And from our perspective, we had to find alternative ways to deal with it. And there are other tools, but we want to do this because we want to make sure that we're building the right things, and we're building the things that our customers want. But IT asset management and software management, because licensing, right? How many times have you been into an environment or somebody you're taking over that still has Office from 10 years ago on there? Like Office 2007, Outlook doesn't work, really? Because it's 15 years old. Well, I need to update, say I can't log in anymore. Well, because it needs SSL and you don't know the password because it was from 5 people ago. And you're still sharing the shared credentials. We see that all the time. So, the IT management of, hygiene in terms of licensing and software requirements and hardware requirements and access to the systems is something that is a battle that you will fight every single day. But if you have good processes in place, that battle becomes much easier to win. So that's really something, as you're thinking about your IT operations and support, there are really, really good plans and software that we use, as an industry and a technology industry that makes our lives easier. Now, that's not to say that when we look at systems, we do the same type of vetting. I mean, we talk to vendors, hundreds of vendors. We go to every trade show under the sun, from the RSA conference to IT Nation to Kaseya Connect to DataCon, and we see every vendor who's selling us the same bill of goods that you are seeing from the DSO side, the vendors are selling you. But our job is to make sure from a technology standpoint that it's going to solve the problem, because ultimately we support you. And if we can't support you effectively, there's no value. firewalls, antivirus, intrusion detection, CrowdStrike, Sentinel-1, all these tools, everything out there, security audits. I mean, let's talk about the cyber side, employee training. How often are you implementing like phishing attempts? Like, we do it quite often. And it's great. I love it when I see an email forwarded to me saying, hey, this doesn't look right. Thank God. I'm so happy. And then, sometimes this doesn't look right because the person who wrote it was, not very articulate. That's different, but it's something in the organization. But if this doesn't look right because they're looking for a financial report from you've never seen, or they're looking for HR documents, thank you for letting me know. We really appreciate that. And that's something that, training is always the key. Like, I spoke at the RSA conference back in 2015. And one of the keys was the human factor. And even back then, the humans are the biggest security breach ever, because it's somebody doing something. AI is getting really good at mimicking humans, right? But it's learning because it's still following the conditioned things that we do. So when you have AI coming in and acting as a human, and then the human interaction, our social construct is to interact, we don't know that it's AI. It's getting so good that it's happening. I mean, even code generation, like with a software background, like looking at code that AI wrote, it's beautiful. I mean, it's like back when malware was first coming into play many years ago, developers were writing code, and you can see nuances in developers' code. Like everyone's got a style, just like your handwriting. Like when you write a script a certain way, you have a nuance and you have a feeling around it. Well, when you're doing that, you're seeing code right now, it's becoming so elegant and written so well that it's absolutely like, we're awestruck in what we see. We're also awestruck with the fact of how quickly these tools are built and how quickly they're being exploited. I mean, quite frankly, you can go into any of your favorite AI engines and ask it to write a script, a PowerShell script to find something on your network very, very easily. Like, we use them all the time to help, automate our processes, right? Between Copilot and ChatGPT and, there's Gemini and all these other tools out there, but they're also being used for nefarious reasons, much more than they're being used for good reasons. And when you look and when you deconstruct an event, and when, we actually deal with malware and deconstructing, the actual attack and deconstructing, the whole network traffic, from start to finish and reverse engineering the encryption, looking at that. When you look at the code, we're literally blown away. I mean, it is something that no matter how much of a white hat hacker you are, and no matter how much there's somebody who has a lot more money behind it paying for someone else to do it. And we're also going against millions and millions and millions of hackers on a daily basis. I mean, when you look on the dark web, it is outright scary to see what you can get for like $2, like literally $2. You can say, I want a script, and somebody will write you a script. It's scary, but having strong, backup and having, detection, like, MDR, managed detection and response, right? So it's not a matter of, if you're going to get hit, it's when you're going to get hit and how you're going to recover from that. Because everyone's going to get it. Everyone is. It's just, we see it every day when you're getting a letter in the mail that says, oh, you've been involved in a breach from Citibank, or you've been involved in a breach from your healthcare provider, or whatever. It's just happening. So now how do we mitigate and how do we lower that time to recovery? Because that's really important. Once we understand that, and once we understand how we can get back quickly and operationally, we're in a better spot. We talked about data warehousing. I mean, the idea here is that data is what we live by. And data is what is going to make our businesses more, more effective and more efficient and more profitable, right? Because if we're, doing something that is not profitable for our business, we probably should stop doing that. And if you don't have the data to tell you that this is not effective, you need to figure out a way to do that. So having the proper data management in place and having the right tools and the real-time data synchronization is something that AI is really helping with, and and especially in the cloud-based. I mean, being able to look at a data set to be like, what does our our day look like today? What does our end of the day look like? What's tomorrow? What's our projections for the week? That's amazing, because now what do I need to do for this quarter, or what do I need to do to meet my goals? We all see it everywhere. Like the dental practices are goal driven, right? And as most businesses are. If you have the data in front of you, you can work towards your goal much easier. because you're not looking for it, you're not scrambling for it. So you're not saying, oh, it took me too long to generate this report, and now this report is stale. You don't want that. That's like the worst thing you can do is when you try to generate something and have bad data. Because you want one source of truth, right? You want that source of truth to be as accurate and as clear as possible, and you want to be able to report off that data immediately. And having that in your hands makes you a much more efficient business. Management, I mean, we all know this. Security is the lifeblood of what we do. It's the bane of our existence as well. I mean, there's, what's the risk reward? Security by obscurity doesn't work anymore. Security where you have, multi-factor 10 times over and somebody's frustrated, or, how many times that we're still looking for complex passwords for people to do, but they're still writing a post-it note and putting it on with a keyboard. We see it all the time, right? Security is something that we have to take seriously because it's being exploited even as we are taking seriously. So imagine if we didn't, how much more we'd be at risk. And that's something that we really need to take to heart. This is a battle that we are always going to fight, always. And when you have multi-billion-dollar companies succumbing to security issues, you know that the challenge you have in front of you is really hard. So working with a really good, IT provider and managed service provider and your internal IT infrastructure team is something you really have to take into account. Because again, if your systems are down, you're not generating revenue. And that's something we really, really, really need to understand. Compliance, as we're talking to, the HIPAA side of it and the HL7 regulations and GDPR and PCI comes in everywhere because credit card transactions. We have to comply as much as we don't want to. I mean, IT departments get all the time through a practice of forwarded email saying, I need to do my PCI assessment. Well, yeah, you do. Because you're running this many transactions and you have to do it. It's just nature of the beast, right? When you have centralized tools, you have bigger environments that are payers are being done through their cloud provider, that reduces your scope. So now that comes out of it, right? That becomes out of your area that you're responsible for. But if you're still, swiping cards at a practice with tapping, or have an individual website where you're doing a payment gateway, you still have to comply with that stuff. So as you start to think about what you're working on, making sure you're complying with all these regulations is definitely something that is always going to be a challenge, but we want to make sure that we're moving in that right direction. Backups, recovery, validation, right? So have your backup plans, we know this, right? Cloud makes it a lot easier, hopefully they have really good plans in place. One of the things I can't stress enough is that when you are working with a cloud provider is have them provide you the documentation on what their disaster recovery plan is, what their service level agreements are, what their provider agreements are with their internet providers, what's the supply chain that they work with, because who is their cloud provider, who is their internet service provider. Supply chain attacks have been happening for years because you have a secure environment. I mean, I don't know if you guys remember back in the early, I think it was like 2011, 2012, TJX Corporation, so TJ Maxx Marshalls, it was the largest credit card breach in the world at the time. That started with a supply chain attack by an air conditioner vendor. Air conditioner vendor had a monitoring tool in their environment that was basically making sure the building was cool at their headquarters in Boston, right outside Boston. And that tool was on the internet, and next thing you know, that tool was connected to their internal network, and it was an enormous breach. It was at the time the largest one. Now it's like tiny compared to it. But that's been a supply chain thing for years, and that's continuing to happen. SolarWinds was a supply chain. I mean, there's a lot of them out there, and it's happening every day. So we really need to understand who our vendors are and what they're doing. Like, when we talked about vendor management yesterday, that is really important. Like, what is, you may have 100 vendors out there who you're working with, and your job to vet them is, do they do what they say they're gonna do? Are they meeting their SLAs? Do they have the proper insurances in place? Do they have the proper recovery tools in place to make sure that if they have an issue, you're notified properly and your environment is protected? Do they have data hygiene in place where, is your data commingled with someone else's? You can't have that. And knowing that and having them document that and providing you that documentation helps in so many ways, especially if there is an issue in your environment, because you now have documentation and proof showing that this is, I've complied, I've done everything I can do. APIs, middleware, I mean, it's the the whole idea here is sharing data, right? So, Jacob is working on a great platform that, will have control with integration and being able to see data that, very few people will be able to see. That's amazing, right? Being able to have that control. Working at the middleware that's going to facilitate the communication. So your middleware, which could be your business analytics and reporting, it could be your financial system, it could be what you're doing for insurance, compliance. All those things have to talk to each other, right? So when you have the HL7 and you have all your requirements and your unified languages, we are talking about these APIs that are connecting everything together. That is super interesting because these are things that with one change can break everything. I.e., one of the tools that we built. We made one change to an API that we were forced to change because Microsoft made a change and it broke the whole thing. And it went from a tool that was working completely fine to a tool that was worth absolutely nothing because of one change. And that happens more often than not. And that's something where, unless you have a vendor who's really working in that place and has the resources and time, you need to focus on, what tools are we using to make things are completely effective and operational. HL7, I think, is really cool. I'm not sure if anyone really has ever heard of it here, but it's basically a language that allows tools to talk to each other in the healthcare space. And it is just a really exciting thing because finally somebody's taking into account that there are 100 different platforms out there and everything's doing something differently and everything has its own, interoperability. It's finally happening, like, lab systems and imaging software. How many times have you guys, I'm sure over the years have heard, like, I can't open an image from this platform in this tool. Or I can't, move something, this file doesn't match, or whatever, I have to convert this. HL7 is now basically helping fix that. So that is something that you're gonna start hearing a lot of over the next couple of years, is how this interoperability is coming into play. So secure data exchange, right? So as you're doing, for instance, insurance billing, right? You wanna make sure you're doing the right codes. There's the next set of ICD codes are I think, already in discussion already and are going to cause everyone more nightmares because of the additional, now it's I think it's 4 decimal points for the next iteration. So, your coding is going to be completely different going forward in the next few years as well. Making sure that the data is, secure during transfers, right? We're sending data, how many times have you seen people still just send, a referral to somebody that's just an open email, like with an attachment and, just it happens. People still do that. But as we're doing it now with cloud and better communication systems, we can do it through the cloud and offer that. Like, you're able to do data transfers and share things on a much faster base and without disruptions. Governance and compliance, right? We hear this all the time. We talk about HIPAA, we talk about GDPR, we talk about PCI, we talk about HL7, we talk about all these things. We have to make sure we're compliant because at the end of the day, once you've documented everything, your documentation potentially is your get out of jail free card. And that's something that's really important. So when people talk about their annual, HIPAA assessments, when they talk about doing their quarterly, PCI scans, do them. It's really not that hard. I mean, Patrick has talked about this hundreds of times on stage. It's not that hard to, fill out the minor in the questionnaire. It really is not. You spend more time complaining about having to do it than actually doing it. It's like, we see it all the time. And it reminds me when I was a kid trying to do my homework. I'm like, I don't want to do it, I don't want to do it. And then I actually sat down to do it. I was like, oh, it wasn't so bad. If I had done that a lot, I would have been much further along in my academic career. But knowing that, now, I guess hindsight's 20/20, but knowing that, just do these. It's really not that hard, and it's going to save your butt from a legal standpoint later on. Now, I don't even pretend to play a lawyer on TV because I have one standing in the back and he takes care of everything for me. But doing that really puts things at ease for when you have a legal issue. Because you have everything documented, you follow procedures, you've done everything you're supposed to do, and you're complying and you're doing the best practices. And again, we all know that HIPAA is not a hard, saying you need to implement this type of firewall with this type of packet inspection, and this type of firmware cycle, whatever. It doesn't work like that. But as long as you're working and moving towards compliance and documenting what you're doing, that is a huge win for your business and a huge win for your compliance. we all know this. I mean, making sure you're staying up to date, making sure that you are, compliant with high tech, making sure that you're, accepting, any and adapting to any of the law changes, right? So we're seeing this, that there are changes that are happening, HIPAA not so much, but with the private industry stuff, so the PCI, PCI DSS is now up to another one, right? It's another version of PCI DSS is coming out. And they're 3 years, and they do like a 3.5-year cycle, so that's constantly evolving. HIPAA hasn't evolved so much over the past few years, but it's still, people are violating it. So it's like, what drives me nuts when I think about this is that you've had all this time to know about HIPAA, and you're still not complying with it. I mean, that's ridiculous to me. It's not like something that just came out, last week and says, oh, if you don't do this, by the end of the year, you're gonna have a problem. It's been around for years. High tech's been around for years. Do something about it. Just literally just take the time and fill it out. Identifying the risks, making sure you're actually doing the internal audits, and quite honestly, you want to make sure that as you're working through this, I'd rather do an internal audit and find a mistake before an external breach happens. I'd rather take the time and be humble enough internally with my team and my group to be like, hey, we found the problem. I don't want it to be an environment where someone's afraid to say something. If we find a problem, we need to find a problem, we need to fix it. That is super important. So recognizing that, that there is, something is going to happen, but let's be prepared for it. Like, you don't want to pay your insurance premiums every single month because they're really expensive. But if you ever need it, you're really happy you paid your insurance premiums. I mean, it's just, that's what it is. And we want to be in the spot where, yeah, we don't want to have to do it, but it's better to have it and implemented and tested and be in place where we know how we're going to be effective and how we're going to move forward and how we're going to execute during a plan. Because everybody knows when there's an emergency, Mike Tyson said it the best, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face, right? Everyone's got a plan. And if you have a plan, and if you are going through this and you don't use the plan that you put in place, and then there's a post-mortem afterwards, and an auditor comes in and says, well, where's your disaster recovery plan? Well, it's right here. How can you do anything on your disaster recovery plan? I don't know. We were in the moment. We had to get this up and running. Well, that's part of the reason why you test. Like, we always go back to, the military talks about this, law enforcement talks about this all the time. You go back to your most basic level of training, right? So if you're reinforcing the training and you're doing your disaster recovery tests, and you're doing this with your your practices, and testing every so often, just pick a random practice, say, hey, we want to take you offline on a Saturday or Sunday, just to see how quickly we can recover. And you do it when they're after hours, you do it when they're closed, it's really just, you go in there and you unplug a connection and see what happens, and see how you recover. I mean, it's a great exercise. I mean, listen, remember in school you had fire drills? Everyone knew where to go. Everyone knew where, what the assembly area was. It's the same thing. It's a fire drill for your business. Because at the end of the day, those fire drills really do save lives. At the end of the day, these disaster recovery plans and incident recovery models, they do save your business. Because the faster you can get your business up and running, the more effective you can be in going back to doing what you're best at, and is treating patients. So basically, listen, we know all these things are super important. You're scaling your business every single day. You're acquiring, new practices. You're growing. You're doing everything you can to be in a spot where you can, potentially have a great financial year and make, a bunch of practices super happy and treat, tons of patients and give everybody new smiles and solve a lot of problems, right? IT is not an expense. It's not. And whatever anyone says, whatever a CFO or a board comes in and says, I can't believe our spend. Well, imagine what your spend would be if you didn't have IT, because you wouldn't have any money to spend it. And that's really the call to action, making sure you understand that investment is really an investment. The more effective you become, the more efficient you become, the better you become at using the tools in front of you and scaling those tools and using tools that will scale with you, not to solve the problem for today. You need to be thinking about the problems that are going to happen a year from now. So when you're talking about scaling it, when you're talking about building a tool or buying a tool, and you're talking about working with a vendor, you need to know their roadmap just as much as they need to know yours. That's about it, guys. I appreciate the time. And, if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out. Really, it's one of those things that you guys are excellent at what you're doing. But IT is something that we are good at, and we're here to help figure that out and move forward. But really appreciate you guys listening, especially after a late night last night. And I didn't fall off the stage, so I had to start. I didn't do any comedy for that. So I'll take the stairs on the way down. But really appreciate it one time. Thank you.